They left her sitting on the station bench with blood on her sleeve and no one waiting for her, and by the time the shadows shifted across the platform for the second time, Clara Wynne understood that the decision had already been made without her, because a place like that did not pause for women who failed to arrive as expected, and when her legs finally gave out, it happened quietly, her body folding against a wooden crate beside the bench as if she were resting rather than collapsing, her fingers still locked around the small valise that held everything she owned, the iron smell of dried blood mixing with coal smoke and dust, while the station carried on around her as though she were part of the structure instead of a person. She tried to stand again when the dizziness eased for a moment, but the pain flared sharp beneath her ribs and forced her back down, her head bowed not in prayer but calculation, because drawing attention had become dangerous the moment the man she had been sent to marry turned away, without speaking her name, and boarded the return carriage, leaving her unclaimed in full daylight, her future undone with the same ease it had been arranged. The conductor passed her twice, watch in hand, eyes carefully averted, and the other women who had arrived on the morning train were already gone, collected by men whose relief carried a quiet sense of ownership. While Clara remained alone in the widening space no one wished to cross, neither questioned nor assisted, just another problem the station intended to outlast. She told herself she would rise when the shaking stopped, that she only needed a moment more. But the moment stretched thin and uncooperative, and when she pressed her palm to her side to steady her breathing, she felt the warmth there and knew she had waited too long for someone who was never coming back. Eli Mercer arrived with a coil of rope over his shoulder and the intention of buying a horse, nothing else weighing on him except the price and the daylight left to make the trade, and he would have passed her like the rest, if not for the way she attempted to stand once more and failed. The sound she made caught between effort and exhaustion, small but unmistakably human, and he stopped. Not sharply, not with urgency, but long enough to truly look, to notice the blood stiffening the fabric at her sleeve, the tremor in her hands as they tightened around the handle of her bag, and the absence of anyone standing near her, which told him more than any explanation could have. He did not ask who she belonged to or why she was there, because the answer was written in the empty space around her and the way the station had already begun to move past her. And when he spoke, it was only to say her name, reading it from the tag tied to her valise as if testing whether she was still conscious enough to answer, and Clara lifted her head slowly, meeting his eyes with the guarded stillness of someone who had learned not to expect rescue, saying nothing because she did not yet know whether he was another man who would look once and leave, or the only one who might refuse to let the station decide she was finished. Eli did not touch her right away, which was the first thing Clara noticed as the dizziness slowly loosened its grip, and the world steadied enough for her to see him clearly, standing close but not crowding, his shadow falling across the platform without cutting her off from the light. And it was that restraint, more than the concern in his eyes, that made her lift her head instead of shrinking back, because men who meant to decide things for you usually started by moving you where they wanted you to be. He asked if she could stand, not if she should, and when she tried and nearly folded again, he caught her elbow with a grip that was firm but brief, letting go the moment her feet found balance, as if he were proving to both of them that staying upright was still her choice. The station clerk cleared his throat nearby, uncomfortable now that the situation had acquired a witness, and muttered something about passengers needing to clear the platform, but Eli answered with a look that said the conversation was finished before it had begun. And then he guided Clara away from the bench and toward the low rail where the freight wagons waited, not explaining what he intended, only moving at a pace slow enough that she could keep up without feeling rushed. He gave her water from his canteen and waited while she drank, turning his body slightly away so she wouldn't feel watched. And when she handed it back, her fingers brushed his, and she flinched on instinct, apologizing too quickly, which told him more than the blood on her sleeve ever could. He asked where she was meant to go, And when she hesitated, he didn't press, simply nodded once and said there was a place she could sit that wasn't out in the open, and led her to the wagon where the boards cut the wind and the noise dropped enough that her breathing finally slowed. The rope slipped from his shoulder, and he set it down as though the errand that had brought him here no longer mattered. Then he knelt just long enough to look at her side, careful not to touch again, and said the injury would need tending whether she stayed or not, which was the first time he had acknowledged the idea that she might leave. And the way he said it, without warning or hope, made the offer feel real instead of conditional. Clara listened, her eyes fixed on the grain of the wood beneath her hand, and realized that in all the planning that had brought her west, she had never imagined this moment. A stranger offering space without asking for proof she deserved it, and when Eli stood and said he would return in a moment, leaving his coat draped over the wagon rail within her reach, but not placing it on her shoulders himself, she understood that whatever happened next would depend not on whether she was worthy of staying, but on whether she could accept the space he was giving her long enough to breathe. Clara did not put the coat on right away, even though the chill crept in as soon as the sun slipped behind the station roof, because accepting warmth had become tangled in her mind with owing something back, and she had learned the cost of that kind of debt long before she ever boarded a train. So she folded the fabric across her lap instead and focused on keeping her breathing steady, while the ache in her side deepened into something sharper and more insistent. Eli returned with a small tin of salve and clean cloth torn from a sack he'd purchased without comment, setting them down beside her and asking permission before he knelt again. And when she nodded, he worked carefully, his movements practiced but gentle, as if tending an animal that could bolt if startled, cleaning the wound without asking how it had happened, which somehow made it easier for her to speak when the words finally pressed too hard against her chest to stay there. She told him she had arrived 2 days earlier than expected because the train schedule had shifted, that the man she was sent for had taken one look at her and decided the inconvenience wasn't worth it, that he had not shouted or insulted her, which would have been easier to understand, but had simply said nothing and turned away, leaving her standing on the platform with her bag and her name and nowhere they belonged. She did not cry as she said it, only kept her eyes fixed on Eli's hands, describing the events in the flat, careful way people use when they are trying not to ask for pity. And when she paused, he did not fill the silence, did not reassure her or correct the cruelty of it, only tied the cloth snugly and told her the bleeding had slowed, which was the first thing anyone had said to her that felt like fact instead of judgment. She went on then, admitting that she had tried to find work nearby, that she had slept in the waiting room until the clerk made it clear she was no longer welcome, that the fall had come when she realized she was growing weak from hunger and had pushed herself too far. And as she spoke, she waited for the moment when his expression would change, when the calculation would begin, and she would see the cost of staying reflected back at her. But it never did, because Eli listened the way he stood, still unyielding and present, absorbing what she offered without deciding what it meant for him yet. When she finished, the silence that followed did not feel like abandonment, but like space again. And for the first time since she had stepped off the train, Clara allowed herself to wonder what it might mean to be seen not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who had survived something and was still standing, even if only just. The pressure arrived quietly, the way most judgments do, first in the form of looks that lingered a second too long and conversations that stopped when Eli turned his head, because a man who paused on a platform for someone the town had already dismissed was bound to become a question himself. The station clerk returned with a deputy not long after, his voice carrying just enough authority to make Clara stiffen where she sat, and asked Eli whether the woman was under his responsibility now, the phrasing careful, as though offering him a chance to step back before the assumption hardened into expectation. Eli did not answer right away, and in that pause, Clara felt the weight of what staying might cost him settle into the space between them, because this was no longer about water or a coat or a place to sit, but about whether he was willing to be named as the one who had taken on what others had refused. He looked at the deputy and said only that she was injured and would be leaving when she was able, which was true and incomplete in equal measure, and the clerk frowned, reminding him that the station could not be held responsible if she remained, that there were rules about loitering and passengers without tickets, all spoken with the practiced tone of someone who had long ago learned how to disguise discomfort as procedure. Eli listened without interrupting, then picked up his rope and slung it back over his shoulder. Not as a signal of departure, but as a reminder that he had arrived with a purpose and was now choosing to change it, and told them he would take her with him until she recovered enough to decide her next steps, his voice even, neither defensive nor apologetic. The deputy hesitated, glancing at Clara as though seeing her properly for the first time, then nodded once and stepped back, satisfied that responsibility had been named and transferred, and as they walked away the murmurs resumed, carrying words like burden and mistake and trouble that Clara pretended not to hear, even as they lodged themselves deep beneath her ribs. Eli turned to her then and said the road to his ranch was long and the wagon ride would not be comfortable, that she would need to decide whether she could manage it, and the way he framed the choice made it clear that this was not an offer extended lightly, but a line he was prepared to stand behind. And as Clara met his gaze, she understood that whatever followed would change him too, because staying with her now meant carrying the town's judgment alongside her weight, and he was choosing it anyway. They did not leave the station right away, and Clara realized that the pause was intentional, a final space Eli was giving her before the road removed the possibility of turning back without consequence, because once the wagon wheels rolled and the town fell behind them, staying would become something harder than survival. It would become commitment. He helped her into the wagon carefully, bracing the step with his boot and steadying her only when her balance faltered, then stepped back instead of climbing up beside her, leaning against the rail with his arms folded as though the decision were not yet finished. He told her there was a boarding house 2 miles down the road that would take her in for a night or two, long enough for her to recover and make other arrangements, and that if she preferred, he could see her there and return to his own business without further complication. The words delivered plainly, without pressure or relief attached to either outcome. Clara listened, her hands resting on the blanket he had placed beneath her without comment, and felt the unfamiliar weight of being allowed to choose settle into her chest, because every offer she had been given before had come with an expectation attached, a debt she was meant to repay in obedience or gratitude, and this one did not. She imagined the boarding house, the narrow bed and borrowed walls, the way she would lie awake listening for footsteps that might never come. And then she imagined the road ahead, the uncertainty of arriving somewhere she had not planned for, carrying the knowledge that staying would mark her as something other than temporary. She asked what would be expected of her if she went with him, and Eli shook his head once and said only that she would rest until she was able to decide what came next, that his ranch was not a solution, but a place, and places did not demand loyalty in exchange for shelter. The simplicity of it broke something open in her, and Clara realized that for the first time since she had stepped onto the train back east, she was not being chosen or rejected but trusted to know her own limits, and when she lifted her head and said she would take the road with him, her voice did not shake because the decision belonged to her alone. They left the station just as the sun tipped past its highest point, the wagon creaking as Eli guided the horse onto the road without looking back, and Clara felt the moment settle behind them like a door closing, not slammed, not locked, simply no longer open. The ride was slow, measured to her breathing, and when the horse stumbled once on a rut, Eli stopped without being asked, adjusting the harness and checking the wheel before continuing, his attention fixed on what was in front of him rather than the murmurs that followed them out of town. It was not until they reached the first rise beyond the station that someone finally rode up behind them. A man Clara recognized from the platform, his voice carrying irritation thinly masked as concern as he called out to ask whether Eli understood what he was taking on, whether he knew the sort of trouble that came with women left behind. Eli reined in the horse and turned in his seat just enough to answer, his posture relaxed but immovable, and said only that she was injured and under his care until she decided otherwise, the words falling flat and final, leaving no space for advice or correction. The man lingered a moment longer, searching for an opening that never appeared, then shook his head and turned back, satisfied perhaps that the consequences would teach the lesson he could not. And when the road fell quiet again, Clara realized that this was the stand Eli had chosen, not loud or confrontational, but steady enough that the world was forced to adjust around it. He did not reassure her afterward or comment on what had happened, simply handed her the canteen when her breathing tightened and drove on, the rhythm of the wheels and the dust rising behind them, marking the passage of something that could not be undone. By the time the ranch came into view, a low line of fencing, a barn set back from the road, the house small but solid against the open land. Clara understood that the danger she feared was not in being asked to leave, but in being allowed to stay long enough for the choice to change her because Eli had already made his, and it was not one that could be walked back once the gate swung open. Clara's recovery did not arrive all at once, but in small, unremarkable moments that added up to something solid, the kind of healing that happens when days are allowed to stack quietly without anyone demanding progress, and Eli made room for those days without naming the sacrifice, adjusting his routines so she could rest, placing work within reach rather than assigning it, and treating her presence as something ordinary enough that it stopped feeling temporary. She learned the rhythm of the ranch by watching him first, the way he moved through chores without hurry, the way he checked fences twice when storms threatened, the way he listened more than he spoke. And when she finally began to help, it was because she wanted to, not because she was expected to earn her place, and the difference mattered more than she had known to explain. The town's judgment did not disappear, but it softened at the edges as weeks passed and nothing terrible happened, as Clara remained, and Eli did not falter. And when she rode into town beside him for supplies, the looks held less certainty, replaced by the discomfort of people realizing their warnings had not come true. It was on one of those trips back, the wagon moving slowly beneath a sky turning warm with late afternoon light, that Clara spoke of staying not as a question, but as a future, saying she had begun to imagine seasons instead of departures. And Eli answered not with a promise, but with action, reaching across the seat to steady her as the road dipped, leaving his hand there longer than necessary, the contact simple and unforced. Their partnership grew the same way, through shared work and shared quiet, through meals eaten at the same table and decisions made together without ceremony, until love revealed itself not as something sudden or declared, but as the life that formed naturally around two people who had chosen not to walk away from one another. When Clara stood beside Eli at the edge of the pasture one evening, the land stretching out in front of them and the house behind them, holding the weight of everything they had built, she understood that staying had not cost either of them what they feared it might. And Eli, watching the light settle across the fields they now shared, knew that the choice he had made at the station had not been about rescue or obligation, but about recognizing a future when it appeared, injured and uncertain, and deciding to claim it together. If this story stayed with you, like it, share it, and subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for quiet stories of love, redemption, and survival.